The summer of 2007 in Albuquerque was unforgiving. By mid-July, the heat had settled over the city like a heavy blanket, turning the asphalt into soft tar and forcing residents to seek refuge in air-conditioned spaces. The Sandia Mountains stood in the distance, their peaks shimmering in the desert haze, indifferent witnesses to the secrets buried in the valley below. On the morning of July 18th, a Wednesday, the sun had barely cleared the horizon when dispatch received a call from the industrial district on the city's south side. The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus Reyes, a warehouse supervisor who'd arrived early for inventory checks. What he found would set in motion an investigation that wouldn't find resolution for 16 years. The warehouse belonged to Santoro Logistics, a trucking and distribution company that had grown exponentially over the previous decade. The building itself was unremarkable. Corrugated steel walls, loading docks lined with semi-trailers, the constant hum of refrigeration units. But inside, past the main floor where legitimate cargo was stored, Marcus had discovered something that made his hands shake as he dialed 911. Gabriel Santoro, Gabe to everyone who knew him, lay sprawled on the concrete floor of a back office. He was 43 years old, dressed in the expensive casual wear he favored. Pressed slacks, a polo shirt that probably cost more than Marcus made in a week, Italian leather shoes now scuffed and dusty. Blood had pooled beneath his head, dark and already beginning to dry in the warehouse's stifling heat. Detective Sarah Chen was the first investigator on scene. At 36, she'd spent 12 years with the Albuquerque Police Department, working her way up from patrol to homicide. She'd seen her share of bodies, but something about this one felt different from the moment she stepped through that warehouse door. The crime scene told a story, though its meaning remained frustratingly unclear. Gabe had been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the head. The execution-style nature of the second shot suggested a professional hit, but the scene itself was messy. Overturned chairs, scattered papers, signs of a struggle. Whoever killed Gabe had wanted him dead, but they hadn't been entirely in control. Sarah walked the perimeter slowly, her trained eyes cataloging every detail. The warehouse's security system had been disabled, professionally, not just smashed or cut. The cameras had stopped recording at 9:47 p.m. the previous night. Gabe's Mercedes was still in the parking lot, its alarm untouched, keys eventually found in his pocket. No forced entry, no witnesses, no obvious motive that made sense for what appeared to be a simple businessman. Except Gabriel Santoro was anything but simple. As the crime scene technicians worked, Sarah stood outside in the blistering heat, reviewing what she already knew about the victim. Santoro Logistics had appeared seemingly overnight 10 years earlier. Gabe had started with 2 trucks and a dream, or so the story went. Now he operated a fleet of 47 vehicles, moved freight across 6 states, employed over 200 people. The American dream realized in the desert Southwest. But the whispers had always been there, floating through the police department like smoke. Gabe's name appeared in intelligence briefings, always on the periphery, never quite crossing the line into actionable evidence. His trucks moved more than just legitimate cargo, or so the rumors suggested. Weapons heading south toward the border, cash coming back north, maybe drugs, though that was harder to prove and easier to deny. The FBI had opened and closed 3 separate investigations into Santoro Logistics over the years. Each time they'd come up empty. Gabe was careful. He hired the right lawyers, kept the right people close, maintained the appearance of legitimacy with meticulous attention to detail. His books were clean, suspiciously clean, some agents argued, but clean nonetheless. Now he was dead, and Sarah had a murder to solve. The autopsy confirmed what the scene suggested. Gabe had died between 10 p.m. and midnight on July 17th. The first shot had come from close range, catching him in the chest. The second, delivered while he was already down, had been the kill shot. The bullets were 9mm, probably from a Glock or similar semi-automatic, common enough to be untraceable, at least without the weapon itself. Sarah began building a timeline. Gabe had left his home in the North Valley around 8 p.m., telling his wife Elena he had business to handle at the warehouse. Not unusual. Gabe often worked late, especially on weeknights when legitimate operations had quieted down. Elena had been worried when he didn't come home, but not alarmed. Not until the police knocked on her door the next morning. The interviews began immediately. Elena Santoro, elegant and composed despite her shock, insisted she knew nothing about any criminal activity. Her husband ran a trucking company. He worked hard. He provided well for their family. If there were dark rumors, she'd never seen evidence of them. Sarah believed her, at least partially. Some wives knew everything. Some knew nothing. Most fell somewhere in between, choosing willful ignorance over difficult truths. Gabe's employees presented a united front of carefully calibrated ignorance. They'd liked their boss. He paid well, treated people fairly, ran a tight ship. If he had dealings beyond the straight and narrow, nobody wanted to admit knowing about them. Sarah recognized the pattern. Fear mixed with loyalty, a combination that made people's memories conveniently unreliable. The financial records told a more interesting story, though interpreting it proved challenging. Santoro Logistics had revenue streams that seemed legitimate on paper. Contracts with manufacturers, retail distributors, even some government agencies. But buried in the details were inconsistencies. Trucks that logged miles without corresponding cargo manifests. Payments from shell companies that existed only on paper. Cash deposits that came in regular patterns, just under the reporting thresholds that would trigger automatic scrutiny. Sarah worked the case 18 hours a day for the first month. She interviewed over 100 people. She followed financial trails that led to dead ends and offshore accounts. She coordinated with the FBI field office, sharing information and frustration in equal measure. The feds wanted to believe Gabe's death was connected to organized crime, but proving it meant unraveling a network that had spent years insulating itself from exactly this kind of scrutiny. The leads dried up quickly. Forensic evidence was limited. The crime scene had been professionally cleaned of anything useful. The few fingerprints found belonged to people who had legitimate reasons to be in that warehouse. No DNA beyond Gabe's own blood. No fibers. No trace evidence that pointed anywhere productive. The bullets were generic. The shell casings pristine but unremarkable. Whoever pulled the trigger had known what they were doing. By September, the investigation had stalled. Sarah still believed the answer lay somewhere in Gabe's business dealings. In the shadow network she could sense but couldn't quite see. But believing wasn't enough. She needed evidence, and evidence was exactly what she didn't have. The case began to cool. Other murders demanded attention. Resources shifted. The file stayed open, but active investigation slowed to a crawl. Sarah would return to it periodically, reviewing statements and evidence logs, hoping something new would jump out at her. It never did. Years passed. The warehouse where Gabe died was eventually sold, renovated, turned into climate-controlled storage units. Elena Santoro moved away from New Mexico, starting over somewhere else. Santoro Logistics was absorbed by a larger company, its trucks repainted, its legacy absorbed into something bigger and more anonymous. But the mystery remained. In the quiet moments of her career during late nights at her desk, Sarah would pull out the file and page through it again. Who killed Gabriel Santoro? More importantly, why? What had he known or done that made his death necessary? And why had the usually talkative criminal underworld stayed so completely silent about his murder? The desert kept its secrets, and Albuquerque moved on. But justice, as Sarah had learned over the years, didn't operate on anyone's timeline but its own. What really happened that night in the warehouse? Was it a professional hit, or did something go wrong? Stay with us as we dive deeper into the criminal network that Gabriel Santoro tried to build, and the secrets that died with him. Understanding Gabriel Santoro's death required understanding the empire he'd built, an empire that existed in the spaces between legitimacy and criminality, visible enough to seem real, but opaque enough to hide its true nature. Gabe hadn't started as a criminal. That distinction mattered to the investigators who would later piece together his story. Born in 1964 in Los Lunas, a small town just south of Albuquerque, he'd grown up in a working-class family. His father had been a mechanic, his mother a schoolteacher. Gabe had been smart, ambitious, and frustrated by the limited opportunities his hometown offered. After high school, he'd worked various jobs, construction, warehouse work, eventually landing a position as a dispatcher for a regional trucking company. That's where he'd learned the business, understanding not just how to move freight, but how the entire logistics network operated, who needed what moved where, which routes were profitable, which regulations could be bent without breaking, which officials could be persuaded to look the other way. In 1997, at 33, Gabe had taken his savings and started Santoro Logistics with 2 used trucks and a small office in Albuquerque's South Valley. The timing had been perfect. The North American Free Trade Agreement had opened up cross-border commerce, and New Mexico sat at a crucial junction. Interstate 40 running east-west, Interstate 25 running north-south, highways connecting to Texas, Arizona, Colorado, and the Mexican border. For the first few years, Santoro Logistics appeared to be exactly what it claimed, a hard-working, family-owned trucking operation. Gabe cultivated relationships with legitimate businesses, moving everything from electronics to produce, from construction materials to retail goods. He hired carefully, paid competitively, and built a reputation for reliability. But sometime around 2000, something changed. The investigators who would later examine Santoro Logistics identified 2000 as the inflection point, though pinpointing exactly what shifted proved difficult. The company's growth accelerated dramatically. New trucks appeared on the road. New warehouses were leased. The employee count tripled. Revenue jumped in ways that seemed disconnected from the actual freight manifests. The FBI's organized crime unit had noticed. Their intelligence suggested that Gabe had been approached by representatives of a criminal network with roots in the Southwest. Not quite traditional mafia, not exactly cartel, but something that borrowed from both traditions. These organizations needed logistics, ways to move their products and money across state lines and international borders without attracting attention. Legitimate trucking companies provided perfect cover. The arrangement, as investigators would later reconstruct it, was elegant in its simplicity. Most of Santoro Logistics' business remained completely legitimate. Real companies hired Gabe's trucks to move real cargo, generating real paperwork and real revenue. But mixed into that legitimate traffic were other shipments, cash hidden in loads of furniture, weapons concealed among construction materials, documentation that matched cargo that didn't quite exist, creating paper trails that justified money that needed laundering. Gabe became what organized crime networks valued most, a facilitator. He didn't sell drugs or run prostitution rings or collect protection money. He moved things. Money, primarily, but also weapons when needed, occasionally high-value stolen goods. His trucks crisscrossed the Southwest, and buried in their legitimate cargo were the arteries of criminal commerce. The beauty of the system was its deniability. If a truck was ever stopped and searched, odds were overwhelming that nothing illegal would be found. And even if something was discovered, Gabe could plausibly claim ignorance. With over 200 employees and dozens of trucks on the road, how could he personally verify every load? The drivers were independent contractors following instructions from dispatchers. The warehouse workers loaded what they were told to load. Everyone had deniability, and deniability was everything. But with success came danger. The more essential Gabe became to the network, the more he knew. He understood routes and contacts. He knew which officials took payments to ignore certain irregularities. He had access to financial records that could unravel the entire operation if they ever found their way to the right prosecutor. The FBI had tried 3 times to flip him. Special Agent Raymond Torres, who'd been tracking organized crime in New Mexico for over a decade, had approached Gabe twice in 2004 and once in 2006. The pitch was always the same. Cooperate, provide information, help us dismantle this network, and we'll protect you. Immunity, witness protection, a new life somewhere far from New Mexico. Gabe had refused each time, not angrily or defiantly, but politely and firmly. He was a businessman. He ran a trucking company. He didn't know what Agent Torres was talking about. If there were problems with his operation, he'd be happy to address them. But he wasn't involved in anything illegal. The refusals were frustrating, but not surprising. Cooperating with federal investigators was dangerous. Even with protection, even with new identities and relocation, witnesses had a way of being found. And Gabe had too much to lose. His business, his reputation, his family's security. He'd chosen to play the game, and that meant accepting its rules. But by 2007, something had shifted. The network was under pressure. A parallel DEA investigation into drug trafficking had started connecting dots that led uncomfortably close to Santoro Logistics. A grand jury in Arizona was hearing testimony about weapons trafficking. Prosecutors in Texas were building a case about money laundering that included some of the same shell companies that appeared in Gabe's books. The organization that had brought Gabe in as a facilitator now saw him as a liability. He knew too much. He was too visible. The scrutiny was getting too intense. And there were whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, that Gabe had been contacted by federal agents again, and this time his refusal hadn't been quite as firm. In the weeks before his death, Gabe had been nervous. His wife Elena would later tell investigators that he'd seemed distracted, worried. He'd taken phone calls in private, conversations that left him tense and irritable. He'd made changes to his will. He'd updated the passwords on his business accounts and given Elena access to information she'd never needed before. On July 16, 2007, the day before his murder, Gabe had met with his attorney. The conversation was privileged, protected, but the attorney would later tell investigators that Gabe had seemed concerned about protecting his family and had asked questions about what would happen to his business interests if something happened to him. The next evening, Gabe had driven to the warehouse for what he'd told Elena was a routine meeting. If he'd been afraid, he hadn't shown it. Or maybe he'd believed he could navigate whatever was coming. Maybe he'd thought his value to the organization would protect him. Maybe he'd miscalculated just how expendable he'd become. The crime scene suggested he'd known his killer, or at least hadn't been surprised by their presence. The security system had been disabled by someone with access codes. Gabe had let the person into that back office. There'd been a conversation, maybe a negotiation, maybe just a final accounting, and then the shooting. For 7 years after Gabe's murder, Santoro Logistics continued operating under new management, though its connection to criminal networks became more tenuous. The scrutiny following Gabe's death had made everyone cautious. Some operations shut down, some networks reorganized. The empire Gabe had helped build didn't collapse, but it contracted, became more careful, learned to operate with even less visibility. Detective Sarah Chen had understood most of this context within the first year of her investigation. Understanding it and proving it were different things entirely. She could see the shape of the network, could sense the connections, but every time she tried to pull on a thread, it dissolved in her hands. The FBI maintained their files. The DEA kept watching. Local law enforcement stayed alert. But without evidence, without witnesses, without someone willing to break the code of silence, the investigation into Gabriel Santoro's murder remained exactly what it had been on day one. A mystery with obvious suspects and no way to prove anything against them. What investigators didn't know in 2007, couldn't have known, was that the answer was sitting in plain sight. Someone who'd worked closely with Gabe. Someone who knew the operation intimately. Someone who would carry those secrets for 16 years before circumstances finally forced them into the light. The network Gabe built was sophisticated and deadly, but even the most careful criminal organizations make mistakes. In the next chapter, we'll discover how one man's survival instinct would eventually unravel everything. Keep watching. Time has a strange effect on unsolved cases. In the first year, everything feels urgent and possible. Every lead might be the breakthrough. Every witness interview could crack the case wide open. But as months stretch into years, that urgency fades. Files get archived. Detectives retire or transfer. Memories become unreliable. Evidence degrades. Justice delayed often becomes justice denied. By 2015, 8 years after Gabriel Santoro's murder, Detective Sarah Chen had been promoted to sergeant and moved to a different unit. The Santoro case remained officially open, but no one was actively working it. The warehouse where Gabe died had been demolished and rebuilt. Most of the people who'd been interviewed had moved on with their lives. The criminal network that Gabe had served had either dispersed or evolved into something harder to track. The case seemed destined to join the thousands of unsolved murders that haunt police departments across America. Crimes everyone knows happened. Crimes with obvious criminal connections. Crimes that nonetheless resist all efforts at prosecution. The perfect murder, in its way, wasn't one without clues, but one where the clues led nowhere useful. But the universe has a way of disrupting carefully maintained secrets. In the criminal underworld, loyalty is always temporary. Alliance is always conditional. People make deals to save themselves. Operations get exposed through seemingly unrelated investigations. And sometimes someone who's carried a secret for years finally decides that staying silent has become more dangerous than speaking. In March 2023, a man named Vincent Cordero walked into the FBI field office in Phoenix, Arizona, and asked to speak with someone about a murder in New Mexico. He was 56 years old, graying at the temples, wearing khakis and a button-down shirt that gave him the appearance of a suburban insurance agent, which, in fact, he was. Vincent had worked for a mid-sized insurance company for the past 9 years, processing claims, attending meetings, living a quietly anonymous life. But before that, Vincent Cordero had been Vincent Martelli. And before that, before he'd entered witness protection and disappeared into a new identity, he'd been Vince Martelli, the logistics manager for Santoro Logistics from 2003 to 2009, and one of Gabriel Santoro's most trusted employees. The decision to come forward hadn't been easy or sudden. Vincent had spent 16 years building a new life, maintaining his silence, honoring the code that said you didn't talk to authorities no matter what. But circumstances had changed. Earlier that year, Vincent's daughter had been in a serious car accident. She'd survived, but the experience had rattled him in ways he couldn't quite explain. Mortality suddenly felt real and immediate. The secrets he'd carried felt heavier. More practically, Vincent had learned something that terrified him. The criminal network he'd once been part of was restructuring, consolidating power under new leadership, and the new people in charge didn't know Vincent Martelli had become Vincent Cordero. They were looking for loose ends, people who'd known too much about the old operations. Vincent's name had come up. Someone had started asking questions about whatever happened to Vince, the logistics guy who'd disappeared right after the organization had gone through a period of intense federal scrutiny. Vincent faced a choice: stay silent and hope he remained hidden, or cooperate with authorities and trade information for protection. After 16 years of silence, he chose to talk. The FBI agents who interviewed Vincent that March afternoon quickly realized they had something extraordinary. Vincent didn't just know about Gabriel Santoro's murder, he'd been there. Not in the warehouse that night, but close enough to understand exactly what had happened and why. The story Vincent told was complex, spanning years of criminal operations, but its core was straightforward enough. By mid-2007, the organization that had brought Santoro Logistics into its network had decided Gabe was a problem. The federal investigations were getting too close. Gabe was too visible, too much of a potential target for prosecution. Worse, there were concerns he might flip, might cooperate with the FBI in exchange for immunity. The decision to eliminate Gabe had been made by consensus among the organization's leadership, not a single boss giving orders, but a council of sorts, representatives from different criminal enterprises that shared infrastructure and logistics. Vincent had been in meetings where Gabe's situation was discussed, always in carefully coded language, but the meaning was clear enough. On July 17, 2007, Gabe had been called to the warehouse for what he thought was a meeting about route schedules. He'd been told that a representative from the organization's leadership wanted to discuss some concerns face-to-face, smooth over some misunderstandings, reaffirm their partnership. Gabe had been nervous but had agreed to the meeting. What choice did he have? Vincent had been instructed to disable the security system and make himself scarce. He'd done so at 9:45 p.m., logging out of the system remotely and leaving the warehouse cameras recording nothing but static. He'd driven home, made sure he was seen at a gas station buying beer at 10:15 p.m., establishing an alibi he hoped he'd never need. The actual killer had been a man Vincent knew only as Mateo. Probably not his real name, certainly not someone with any official connection to Santoro Logistics. Mateo was what the organization called a fixer, someone brought in for problems that required permanent solutions. He'd met with Gabe in the warehouse office, and the conversation had apparently not gone smoothly. Whether Gabe had resisted, whether he'd tried to negotiate, whether he'd said something that angered Mateo, Vincent didn't know, but the result had been violent and final. The next morning, when Marcus Reyes discovered Gabe's body, Vincent had been among the dozens of employees interviewed by police. He'd played his role perfectly, shocked, cooperative, knowing nothing. He'd maintained that performance through multiple interviews with Detective Chen and FBI agents. He'd watched the investigation stall, watched the case go cold, all while carrying the knowledge of exactly what had happened. For Vincent, the years after Gabe's murder had been increasingly stressful. The organization had kept him on, using his logistics expertise for several more years. But the federal scrutiny had made everyone paranoid. People who knew too much started having accidents. A dispatcher who'd handled too many suspicious shipments died in what was ruled a suicide, but felt like something else. A warehouse supervisor who'd asked too many questions simply disappeared one day, his car found abandoned near the Rio Grande. In 2009, Vincent had made his own exit strategy. He'd reached out to a federal agent he'd known was investigating the network. Not Raymond Torres, but someone else, someone he'd trusted slightly more. The deal had taken months to negotiate. Vincent would provide information, but not about specific crimes or specific people. Instead, he'd give them the structure, the methods, the way the organization operated. In exchange, he'd get witness protection, a new identity, and a promise that he'd never have to testify unless absolutely necessary. The agreement had held for 14 years. Vincent Cordero lived his quiet life in Phoenix, processing insurance claims, coaching his daughter's soccer team, attending church on Sundays. The FBI had used his information to understand the criminal network better, but they'd never had enough to build prosecutable cases. And Vincent had stayed silent about the one thing that could get him killed, his knowledge of Gabriel Santoro's murder. But now, sitting in that FBI office in March 2023, Vincent was ready to tell the whole story. He'd bring them Mateo, if they could find him. He'd testify about the organization's structure. He'd explain how Santoro logistics had been used to move money and weapons across the Southwest. He'd give them everything, because staying silent had finally become more dangerous than speaking up. The case that had been cold for 16 years suddenly exploded back to life. FBI agents in Phoenix immediately contacted their counterparts in Albuquerque. The old Santoro files were pulled from archives. Detective Sarah Chen, now a lieutenant with the Albuquerque PD, got a call that made her heart race. The murder she'd never been able to solve suddenly had a witness, a confession, a path forward. The investigation's resurrection required careful coordination between multiple agencies. The FBI's organized crime unit took the lead, with support from DEA, ATF, and local police departments across 4 states. Vincent's information opened doors that had been locked for over a decade. Financial records that had seemed meaningless suddenly made sense. Shell companies that had appeared disconnected revealed their relationships. People who'd been peripheral to the investigation became central. The hunt for Mateo took 3 months. Vincent's description and what little information he had about the man led investigators to a former enforcer named Mateo Ruiz, who'd been living quietly in El Paso under his real name, apparently confident that enough time had passed to make him safe from prosecution. When FBI agents knocked on his door in June 2023, Mateo's first question was, "Who talked?" Mateo was 52 years old, balding, overweight, looking nothing like the efficient killer he'd once been. He'd left the criminal life behind years ago, working now as a supervisor at a warehouse. Legitimate freight, legal operations, no connection to his past. But the past, as he was learning, never really disappears. Faced with forensic evidence that Vincent's testimony made newly relevant, faced with the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison, Mateo made his own calculation. He agreed to cooperate. He'd killed Gabriel Santoro, yes, but on orders from higher up the organizational chain. He could give them names, dates, other crimes. He could help dismantle what remained of the network he'd once served. By the fall of 2023, the investigation had expanded far beyond a single murder from 2007. Federal prosecutors were building RICO cases, charging dozens of individuals with racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering, weapons trafficking. Vincent's cooperation and Mateo's subsequent confession had provided the keys to unlock a sprawling criminal enterprise that had operated across the Southwest for over 2 decades. The irony wasn't lost on the investigators. Gabriel Santoro's murder, which was meant to protect the organization by eliminating a potential informant, had ultimately led to its downfall. Gabe had died because people feared he might talk, but it was his death itself and the silence around it that had eventually forced someone else to break ranks and expose everything. Justice was finally within reach, but the story wasn't over yet. The final chapter would reveal not just who killed Gabriel Santoro, but the entire hidden empire that his murder had tried to protect. Stay with us for the stunning conclusion. On the morning of January 14, 2024, federal agents executed coordinated raids across 4 states. The operation involved over 300 law enforcement personnel, FBI, DEA, ATF, U.S. Marshals, and local police departments from New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Colorado. The timing had been carefully planned. 16.5 years after Gabriel Santoro's murder, justice was finally being served. The primary target was a man named Anthony Calabresi, 68 years old, who'd been living in Scottsdale, Arizona, running what appeared to be a legitimate real estate investment firm. To his neighbors, Anthony was a successful businessman, a grandfather who drove a Tesla, played golf 3 times a week, and donated generously to local charities. What his neighbors didn't know was that Anthony had been one of the key architects of the criminal network that had operated throughout the Southwest since the late 1990s. Vincent Cordero's cooperation had given investigators the organizational structure. Mateo Ruiz's confession had provided the violence, but it was Anthony Calabrese who'd run the operation, making decisions about routes and partnerships, resolving disputes, ordering eliminations when necessary, including Gabriel Santoro's elimination. The raids netted 27 arrests that first day. Some were predictable, known criminals with long records, people who'd been suspected but never successfully prosecuted. Others were surprising. A city councilman in Tucson, a logistics company owner in Santa Fe whose operation was eerily similar to what Santoro Logistics had been, a banker in El Paso who'd facilitated money laundering through seemingly legitimate business loans, a customs official in Las Cruces who'd been paid to look the other way when certain trucks crossed back and forth across the Mexican border. The criminal network that Gabriel Santoro had served turned out to be larger and more sophisticated than even the most pessimistic investigators had believed. It wasn't quite Mafia, not in the traditional sense of a hierarchical organization with clear leadership. Instead, it was more like a network of networks, criminal enterprises that collaborated when convenient, sharing resources and infrastructure while maintaining separate operations. At its peak, the organization had moved an estimated $50 million annually through the Southwest. Weapons purchased legally in states with loose gun laws were transported to buyers in Mexico and California. Cash from drug sales flowed in the opposite direction, moving north and east, being laundered through car dealerships, restaurants, construction companies, and trucking operations like Santoro Logistics. High-value stolen goods, electronics, jewelry, even art, moved through the same channels, sold through legitimate-seeming businesses or exported to international buyers. The genius of the operation had been its compartmentalization. Most people involved knew only their small piece of the larger puzzle. Truckers moved cargo without knowing what was really in the sealed containers. Warehouse workers loaded and unloaded without asking questions. Dispatchers followed instructions from managers, who followed instructions from regional coordinators, who answered to people like Anthony Calabrese. Gabriel Santoro had been unusual in that he'd understood more of the big picture than most. As someone who ran a key piece of infrastructure, he'd needed to know routes, contacts, the overall flow of operations. That knowledge had made him valuable. It had also made him dangerous. The prosecution's case centered on RICO charges, Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act violations that allowed prosecutors to charge individuals not just for specific crimes, but for participating in an ongoing criminal enterprise. The RICO statutes were powerful tools, originally designed to combat traditional mafia organizations but adaptable to modern criminal networks. Vincent Cordero became the prosecution's star witness. Over 3 weeks of testimony in federal court, he laid out the organization's structure, explained how Santoro Logistics had been used, described the meetings where decisions were made and problems were discussed. He was nervous on the stand, understandably. Even with protection, even with promises of safety, testifying against organized crime was terrifying. But he held up under cross-examination, his detailed knowledge and careful documentation proving difficult to shake. Mateo Ruiz testified next, describing in matter-of-fact terms how he'd been hired to kill Gabriel Santoro. He described the meeting, the conversation, the moment when he'd realized Gabe understood he wasn't leaving that warehouse alive. He described pulling the trigger twice and the sound Gabe's body had made hitting the concrete floor. The testimony was brutal and necessary, establishing not just that a murder had occurred but that it had been ordered, planned, and executed as part of the criminal enterprise's operations. The defense attorneys fought hard, as they had to. They challenged Vincent's credibility. Wasn't he just a criminal trying to save himself? They questioned Mateo's testimony. Wasn't he the actual killer, making up stories about orders from above? They argued that running a legitimate business that occasionally looked the other way wasn't the same as being part of a criminal conspiracy. But the prosecution had more than just testimony. They had financial records that Vincent had helped them understand, showing money flowing through shell companies and overseas accounts. They had wiretap recordings from a separate investigation that corroborated some of Vincent's claims. They had physical evidence from the Santoro murder scene that matched Mateo's description. And they had a pattern. Dozens of crimes, hundreds of transactions, all fitting together into a picture of organized criminal activity. Anthony Calabrese sat through the trial looking like what he was, an elderly man facing the end of his life. His attorneys painted him as a businessman who'd made some questionable associations but wasn't a criminal mastermind. The prosecution painted him as exactly that, the calculating mind behind an organization that had profited from violence, drugs, and corruption for over 2 decades. The jury deliberated for 4 days. When they returned their verdict, it was comprehensive. Guilty on all counts: racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, weapons trafficking. Anthony Calabrese would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, with no possibility of parole. He was 69 years old at sentencing. The judge showed no sympathy. The other defendants faced similar outcomes. Some took plea deals, cooperating in exchange for reduced sentences. Others fought and lost, receiving terms ranging from 15 years to life. The city councilman from Tucson resigned in disgrace before his trial even began. The customs official in Las Cruces died by suicide 2 weeks after his arrest. The banker in El Paso fled, but was captured in Mexico 6 months later. For Detective Sarah Chen, now Lieutenant Chen, soon to retire after a distinguished career, the outcome was profoundly satisfying. She'd spent 18 years wondering if she'd ever see justice for Gabriel Santoro. In her office, she still kept the original case file, its pages worn from repeated review. When the verdicts came down, she allowed herself a rare moment of emotion, tears she'd held back for nearly 2 decades. Vincent Cordero went back into witness protection with a third identity, relocating once again, starting over once again. He'd done what he'd needed to survive, and in doing so, he'd finally freed himself from the secrets that had haunted him. Whether that would bring him peace was something only time would reveal. Mateo Ruiz received a reduced sentence for his cooperation, 25 years instead of life without parole. He'd be 80 years old before he saw freedom again. In his victim impact statement, he'd apologized to Gabriel Santoro's family, words that rang hollow but were perhaps the best anyone could expect. Elena Santoro attended every day of the trial, sitting in the gallery with quiet dignity. Her husband had been dead for 16.5 years. Their children were grown now, building their own lives, carrying the complicated legacy of a father who'd been both provider and criminal. For Elena, the verdict didn't bring Gabe back, didn't erase the years of wondering and pain. But it provided something: acknowledgement that his death had mattered, that justice, however delayed, had ultimately arrived. The broader impact of the case reverberated throughout law enforcement. The successful prosecution demonstrated that even sophisticated criminal networks could be unraveled, that decades-old cases could still be solved, that silence could eventually be broken. Other investigations were reinvigorated, other witnesses encouraged to come forward. Cold cases got second looks. Criminals who'd thought they were safe began looking over their shoulders. In Albuquerque, the warehouse district where Gabriel Santoro had died continued its transformation. The old industrial buildings were being converted into trendy lofts and artisan studios. Young professionals and artists moved in, bringing coffee shops and breweries, unaware of the violence that had once stained those streets. The city moved forward, as cities do, building new memories over old tragedies. But for those who'd worked the case, who'd carried its weight for all those years, the resolution meant something profound. It meant that perseverance mattered. That documentation and careful investigation, even when they seemed futile, could eventually pay off. That truth, buried and hidden for years, could still emerge into the light. The Santoro case also revealed uncomfortable truths about how criminal organizations thrive. They don't operate in shadows alone. They embed themselves in legitimate society. They exploit the infrastructure of legal commerce. They corrupt officials and institutions. They rely on ordinary people choosing not to see, not to ask questions, not to challenge what seems slightly off. Gabriel Santoro's empire had existed in plain sight. Trucks with company logos driving on public highways, warehouses operating with proper permits, financial transactions processed through legitimate banks. The investigation had uncovered over 200 individuals who'd worked for or with Santoro Logistics during its operational years. Most had known nothing about the criminal activities. They'd just needed jobs, paychecks, benefits for their families. They'd clocked in and clocked out, moving cargo they were told to move, asking no questions because questions weren't welcome. That willful ignorance, multiplied across hundreds of people, had allowed the operation to function for over a decade. In the months following the convictions, journalists descended on Albuquerque, writing articles and producing podcasts about the case. New Mexico mob case solved. After 16 years became a headline that captured national attention. Some coverage was sensationalized, portraying the story as a crime thriller. But the better reporting understood what the case really revealed. How organized crime adapts to modern America, how it exploits legitimate business structures, and how difficult it is for law enforcement to combat criminal enterprises that have learned to operate within the letter, if not the spirit, of the law. The financial impact was staggering. Asset forfeiture proceedings seized millions of dollars in property, businesses, bank accounts, and investments connected to the criminal network. Properties Anthony Calabrese had owned, the Scottsdale mansion, investment properties across Arizona, luxury vehicles, were all confiscated. The seized assets would be used to compensate victims and fund law enforcement initiatives. But perhaps the most significant impact was what happened next in organized crime prosecution. The Santoro case became a template, studied at the FBI Academy, referenced in training programs for financial investigators, cited in legal briefs for other RICO prosecutions. It demonstrated the power of witness cooperation, the importance of financial forensics, and the possibility of cracking cases that seemed hopelessly cold. For the families affected by the network's crimes, not just the Santoros, but dozens of others whose lives had been touched by violence, drugs, and corruption, the trial provided a form of closure. Some family members gave victim impact statements, describing how the organization's activities had destroyed lives. A mother whose son had been killed in a robbery connected to the network, a woman whose husband had been pulled into addiction by drugs the organization had helped distribute, a family whose father had been corrupted while working as a minor player in the operation, spending years in prison for crimes he'd committed on behalf of people who'd never faced consequences. These stories, told in open court, gave human dimension to what could otherwise seem like abstract criminality. They reminded everyone that organized crime isn't victimless, that the drugs and weapons and money moving through criminal networks leave trails of devastation in communities. On a summer evening in 2024, 17 years after Gabriel Santoro's murder, a small memorial service was held at a cemetery in Albuquerque's North Valley. Elena Santoro had arranged it, inviting family members and a few close friends. Father Miguel from the church the family had attended when Gabe was alive gave a short blessing. Elena spoke briefly, her voice steady, talking about remembrance and peace and moving forward. Lieutenant Sarah Chan attended, standing at a respectful distance. She'd been invited by Elena, who'd called her after the trial ended. The two women had talked for over an hour, sharing perspectives on a case that had defined years of both their lives. Elena hadn't forgiven Gabe for his choices, how could she? But she'd made peace with the reality of who he'd been. A complicated man who'd provided for his family through increasingly dark means, who'd eventually paid the ultimate price for the life he'd chosen. As the sun set over the Sandia Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah reflected on what the case had taught her. Justice wasn't always swift, but that didn't mean it was impossible. The truth could stay hidden for years, decades even, but circumstances changed, people's calculations shifted, and eventually, secrets came to light. The work of careful investigation, of meticulous documentation, of refusing to close cases even when they seemed unsolvable, that work mattered. The criminal network that had killed Gabriel Santoro had believed they were untouchable. They'd built sophisticated systems, maintained silence through fear and intimidation, operated for over 20 years without serious consequences. They'd eliminated a man they saw as a threat, cleaned up the crime scene professionally, and watched as the investigation stalled and died. They'd been wrong. One person's decision to finally speak, driven by fear, by conscience, by the desire to protect his daughter, had brought everything crashing down. Vincent Cordero's testimony had opened a door that led to Mateo Ruiz's confession, which led to Anthony Calabrese's conviction, which led to the dismantling of an entire criminal enterprise. In the years since, law enforcement in the Southwest had remained vigilant. Criminal networks didn't disappear just because one was prosecuted. New organizations emerged, learning from the mistakes of their predecessors, adapting their methods, finding new ways to exploit legitimate commerce for criminal purposes. The fight was ongoing, would always be ongoing. But the Santoro case had demonstrated that these networks could be beaten, that patience and persistence and cooperation between agencies could achieve results. For Albuquerque specifically, The case had been transformative. The city had always struggled with the perception that it was a waypoint for criminal activity, a place where drugs and weapons moved through on their way to somewhere else. The successful prosecution helped challenge that narrative, showing that New Mexico law enforcement could handle complex, sophisticated investigations. The case brought federal resources and attention to local crime-fighting efforts. Relationships between local, state, and federal agencies deepened, creating infrastructure for future cooperation. The warehouse district where Gabriel Santoro had died continued its gentrification. The building where his body had been found, demolished years earlier, was now the site of a microbrewery that served craft beer to young professionals. None of them knew about the murder that had occurred on that spot, about the blood that had soaked into concrete that no longer existed. History gets paved over, literally and figuratively as cities reinvent themselves. But some people remembered. Lieutenant Sarah Chen would retire in 2025 after 33 years with the Albuquerque Police Department, but she'd never forget the Santoro case. It had been the defining investigation of her career, the one that got away for so many years before finally, improbably, being solved. She kept a photo from the memorial service on her desk. The sun set over the Sandias, the small gathering of mourners, the sense of closure finally achieved. Vincent Cordero, wherever he was under whatever name he now carried, would remember too. He'd live with the knowledge of what he'd done, both the crimes he'd facilitated and the courage it had taken to finally come forward. His cooperation had saved lives, future victims of a criminal network that would have continued operating if not for his testimony. Whether that balanced against his years of complicity was a question only he could answer. And somewhere in federal prison, Anthony Calabrese would spend his remaining years remembering the empire he'd built and lost. He'd die behind bars, a cautionary tale about the limits of criminal ambition, about how even the most careful organizations eventually fall apart. The story of Gabriel Santoro's murder and the network he'd served became part of Albuquerque's hidden history. Not widely known, but significant to those who understood what it revealed about crime and justice, about secrets and truth, about how long the arc toward justice can be and how it still sometimes bends the right way. On quiet nights in the city, when the desert air cooled and the mountains stood as dark silhouettes against the stars, Albuquerque felt like what it was, an old place where countless stories were buried, some forgotten, some waiting to be discovered, some finally resolved after years of mystery. Gabriel Santoro's story was now complete. The question that had haunted investigators for 16 years, who killed him and why, had been answered. The network he'd served had been exposed and prosecuted. Justice, delayed but not denied, had finally been served. And in the end, that mattered. Not just for Gabe's family, not just for the investigators who'd refused to give up, but for the principle itself. The idea that murders don't go unpunished forever. That criminal networks, no matter how sophisticated, contain the seeds of their own destruction. That truth, buried and hidden for years, can still emerge into the light when someone finds the courage to speak it. The desert keeps many secrets, but some secrets eventually it gives back. The New Mexico mob case of 2007 stands as a testament to the power of persistence in criminal investigation. What began as a seemingly unsolvable murder in an Albuquerque warehouse became a landmark case in organized crime prosecution, demonstrating that even the most sophisticated criminal networks can be dismantled when witnesses find the courage to come forward and investigators refuse to abandon cases that seem impossible to solve. For law enforcement professionals studying the case today, it offers valuable lessons. The importance of thorough documentation, even when investigations stall. The value of maintaining relationships between local, state, and federal agencies. The recognition that witnesses may need years before they're ready to cooperate. The understanding that financial forensics can reveal patterns invisible through traditional investigative methods. For the families affected by the criminal network's activities, the case provided something that had seemed impossible: accountability. The people responsible for Gabriel Santoro's death and countless other crimes finally faced consequences. The organization that had operated with apparent impunity for over 2 decades was exposed, prosecuted, and destroyed. And for the city of Albuquerque, the case became part of its ongoing story. A reminder that beneath the surface of any city, beneath the legitimate businesses and quiet neighborhoods, there are always other stories, darker stories, stories of crime and violence and corruption that occasionally break into the light. Gabriel Santoro made choices that led him down a dangerous path. He built an empire on criminal foundations, profited from illegal activities, and ultimately paid with his life. His story isn't one of redemption or heroism, but his murder and the investigation that finally solved it revealed something important about justice: that it's never too late, that the work of dedicated investigators and the courage of witnesses who finally speak can achieve results even after years of silence. 16 years separated Gabriel Santoro's death from the arrests that finally solved his murder. 16 years during which the truth lay hidden, protected by fear and silence and the careful structures criminal organizations build to insulate themselves from prosecution. But in the end, those structures failed. One person's decision to speak became a crack in the wall, and through that crack, justice finally found its way. The case closed in 2024, but its impact continues. Other cold cases are being re-examined. Other witnesses are finding courage. Other criminal networks are learning that time alone doesn't guarantee safety from prosecution. In the end, the New Mexico mob case proved a simple but profound truth. Justice delayed is not always justice denied. Sometimes it's just justice that requires patience, persistence, and one person willing to finally break the silence. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the New Mexico mob case. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more investigations into true crime cases that reveal the hidden connections between legitimate business and criminal enterprise. Justice may be slow, but as Gabriel Santoro's case proved, it can still arrive. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. Until next time, stay curious and remember, the truth is always worth pursuing.